So, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. This is my first Sunday back after taking a month off. I needed a break from teaching. You needed a break from me. I got that line from Jim Bankson, and I think it's true. And we had great speakers during the time that I was gone. We spent much of that time in the Balkans, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk much about it or show you all the pictures of the vacation. There are 3 blog posts on the Ordinary Life website, and I am really grateful to Wayne Herbert for posting those, fielding them, putting them together, putting the pictures with them, because they come to him piecemeal, and also for maintaining the website and everything while I was gone. This is the territory that we covered in the Balkans. And this is a sad part of the world because it's sandwiched between so many other places with Italy here, Austria, Germany here, Hungary here, Turkey down here, and it just was a route for, over the centuries, so many bad things to have happened. It's also a beautiful place. We picked it because Sherry asked a good friend of ours who travels all over the world where was one of the most beautiful places he'd ever been, and he said the Balkans. And it is truly a beautiful place, very diverse in many, many ways. And I gave up trying to comprehend the complexity of the ethnic, religious, national diversity that marks the long history of that part of the world. One of the lecturers that we heard, we got great lecturers, usually university professors every day to speak to us, said that the thing that most marks this part of the world, formerly known as Yugoslavia, is its cultural diversity. There are 40 different languages spoken in this part of the world and 30 different religions. So I had no idea that Constantine was born in the Balkans. The Roman emperor, there were something like 18 Roman emperors that were born in the Balkans. The emperor that preceded Constantine was a guy named Diocletian. Diocletian was not a follower of Jesus, but he is the one that began to lift the ban of persecution against Christians. And he built a retirement home in Split. It's as big as a city block, 3 stories tall and still standing, and that's a picture of it. It took 10 years to build, built 1900 years ago. We got to see some really old stuff, some spectacularly beautiful, varied terrain. And we got to be in spaces where there have been unbearable, unspeakable atrocities committed by humans against other humans, much of it influenced and inflamed by one political leader who was unhinged from any moral center and driven only by greed and narcissism. So it was not uncommon, particularly in Croatia and Serbia, to be driving down the street and see this, an inhabited dwelling next to one that had been bombed out in the 90s, or to walk down the street and see this. And of course, this is probably the most photographed place in all of that part of the world. They wanted me to become minister of that church, but I said, got other things to do. And then we returned to the United States. There is nothing to refresh and restart the operating system by which you see your country than to be away from it for a long time and to have no news. We only observed one news program one day while we were away, and that was about the Supreme Court hearing. Mark Twain once said, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness." So before I took this month off, I had begun to think that maybe I was going to change the direction of what I was teaching in here. I do that. I still want to speak to the theme of between the no longer and the not yet. But I thought maybe because you're so smart that I could let up a little bit on the biblical literalism stuff and we could do some other things. Then I come back and I read that our president addressed a group of leading evangelicals in the White House and said to them this November 6th election is very much a referendum on not only me, it's a referendum on your religion. And it is terrifying to me to think that anyone who seeks to know and follow Jesus would believe this to be the case. Or would, as any religious leader, enable anybody to believe this. So the purpose of my work as a spiritual teacher, at least one way to put it at the moment, is to find and offer the gift of active hope in the context in which we live right now. I have developed a bit of a sentence completion test. I'll offer it to you. You can take it, and you can take it away from here, and you can use it with people in your circles of influence. And the sentence completion test goes like this. When I consider the condition of our world politically and or environmentally, I think things are getting, and just let people fill it in, and then have a discussion about what that stirs up. Why do they think that, and all of that. Now, your mileage may vary on this, but so far the responses that I have gotten reflect a profound degree of uncertainty about where we are and about our future. And I believe that this uncertainty is the pivotal psychological reality of our time. It shows up in fear that for many people quickly moves into anger and rage. And not to talk about this is to not only close down our conversations, but to close down our thinking. Our immediate context, both nationally and globally, confronts us with realities that are painful to face, they are difficult to take in, and they are confusing to live with. A country in which 50% of the population hates the other 50% of the population cannot go forward with any sort of grace or dignity or integrity. But that's kind of how we find ourselves right now. And my question is, how shall we proceed? So, in this talk today, I want to show you a blueprint of where I hope to go in the weeks and months ahead. I think it's going to be fun. It's a map of the territory that we're going to cover. So that's what today's class is about. As you know, there are values that I seek to teach consistently. They are peace, love, joy, patience, and humility. So we'll be talking about these things over and over and over again. There's nothing new here. And the teacher that I want to honor in these teachings is Jesus, because that is the tradition in which I stand. Now, the movement that Jesus started has been hijacked and co-opted and corrupted in so many ways for so many years that it really takes some scholarly effort to get to the source of the authentic teachings of Jesus. And I want to continue to be involved in that scholarship and to share that scholarship with you because I think it's interesting and I think it's important to know, particularly if we're going to be in that tradition. Now, it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it, that Jesus was not a white evangelical United States citizen. We are. And there are ways to live with that reality and be true to our faith as well. So, though, as you know, I think any label we put on ourselves is a trap. If someone were to ask me what my religious orientation is, I would say, now you come up with your own, I would say that I aspire to be a practitioner of the core values of Jesus. Peace, love, joy, patience, and humility. We've already found values that if we took from here and practiced them in the places where we live out our lives, we would begin to make a difference on this planet. Our goal is to be practitioners. Now, this is where dualistic language just absolutely fails us. So I would say that we are practitioners, not seekers. We're not religious seekers. We've already found. Though the most useful and wisest spiritual identity is that of a practitioner, we are also seekers because we are seeking to be found at deeper and deeper levels by the values that we have already found or that have found us. So we're both seekers and practitioners. That makes sense? A part of the misguided belief of fundamentalism is the truth that they found it. They don't have to seek anymore. There's no more growing to do. So how have we allowed ourselves as individuals and groups to get so far away from these teachings of Jesus? Henri Nouwen once said, we have to keep looking for spiritual questions if we want spiritual answers. So in the first days, after the Jesus movement got started, in the first days, I'm saying the first almost 200, maybe more than that, years, 300 years, when Jesus' followers did what they did, they fed the hungry, they clothed the naked, they sheltered the homeless, all at great personal sacrifice. What people who saw them said about them was, look how they love each other. And now, when they look at us, I fear they say, look at how they take sides. Now, as you may recall, I've been looking at the various premises of Christian fundamentalism and trying to show them as not only limited, but downright dangerous. Fundamentalism in any religion or ideology always ends in violence of one kind or another. Name-calling, blaming, judging, those are violent behaviors. So I'll briefly remind you that the usual listing of the fundamentals of Christian fundamentalism are: the Bible is literally true, the inerrant Word of God. Jesus was literally born of a virgin. Substitutionary atonement is the meaning of Jesus' death on the cross. The miracles of Jesus literally happened. Jesus physically arose from the grave, literally ascended into heaven, and will return someday in the second coming. And what I have decided to do is now begin going through, at some length and in some detail, the various miracle stories that are told in the Jesus narratives about Jesus. We're going to do one of those briefly today to give you an idea of what I hope to do. Now, there are a lot of reasons that I have chosen to do this. For one thing, I think it's important to know this stuff, and I think it's fun to know this stuff. If we're going to stand in the tradition that grew out of the teaching of Jesus, we ought to know what's in that tradition and where and why we got off track. But there is a deeper reason for doing this as well. Every single one of the miracle stories that are told about Jesus, either that or his best stories that are miraculous in and of themselves because we still remember them and they lead to such transformative ways of thinking and behaving in the world, are usually followed by a question that Jesus put to the people around him. And usually it's a hostile crowd. I don't have that here, I hope. Now, I want to suggest something to you again that I have suggested to you before, so endure a bit of repetition. It won't take long, I promise. What I want to encourage you to do is sometime between now and next week, read one of the gospel narratives. And for the purposes of what I want to do in the weeks and months ahead, what I want to suggest is that you get this particular translation of the New Testament called The Message by Eugene Peterson. You can get it on your e-reader or on your Kindle if you want to. And I'm recommending this over The Gospel of Jesus by Funk or The Gospel According to Jesus by Stephen Mitchell. Both of those are outstanding books, but they focus almost exclusively on the teachings of Jesus. And we're going to branch out now and begin to touch not only those, but also some teachings about Jesus, which you can find in, I'm going to suggest that you start with the Gospel of John. It's the most metaphorical of Jesus, of all the narratives of Jesus. So go home sometime this week, turn off the TV, and sit down and read the Gospel of John. It won't take you that long to do. And don't read it critically, read it for fun. Read it just like, okay, I'm reading this story for the first time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was with God. You can know it by heart, I'm sure. But read it. Just read it. The story as it unfolds in the Gospel of John. You'll read also some of the teachings about Jesus. Try to pay attention to the questions that Jesus asked. He is asked by people, somebody figured this out. I got this from Richard Rohr a long time ago. He is asked 183 questions, Jesus is. He answers 3 of them. And 2 of those are not really answers. One of them is simply a request. Teach us to pray, that's one of them. Go read, you find the other 2 on your own. He asked almost 300 questions. That's very disturbing to people who think religion is to have answers. Religion is questions. Jesus didn't provide answers. He provided questions. Remember, we already have what we're looking for. What we seek now is to be wiser and more useful practitioners of the values we say we embrace. The ego wants immediate satisfaction, and that's what fundamentalism provides. The ego will almost always settle for satisfying falsehoods rather than remain on the search for often unsatisfying truth. But Jesus, as our teacher, keeps us on the necessary search. So I want these times together to be about our embracing and learning to live the fact that in the realm of the Spirit, there are not really answers so much as there are answering persons. So one other matter, and then I'll show you the kind of work I have in mind. Now, this is the other matter. I personally do not take what are called the miracles of Jesus as being literally true. There are, by the way, many other miracle workers in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the Christian Scriptures. And next week, we're going to come back and talk about how in the Jewish Christian tradition, miracles arose. Now, miracles exist way outside that tradition too. But how in the Hebrew Scriptures and then in the Christian Scriptures did this whole stuff of the miraculous arise. Now, you may believe the miracles literally. That's your prerogative. If you do, I would suggest a couple of things. First, don't stop by being hung up on the literal nature of the story. Go further. What does the story mean? Not just did it happen, but what is the meaning of this particular story? There's a miracle story in the gospel selection today that Tommy preached on about the healing of the blind man. What does that mean spiritually, metaphorically, that someone receives their sight? Second, if you permit miracle stories about Jesus to be true, can miracle stories attributed to others be true as well? Did flowers literally spring up everywhere that Buddha took a step? Or is that something that's metaphorical about something else? So next week we'll talk about some of that. Today I'm trying to be clear, at least this is true for me, you'll have to say for yourself, that we have found our teaching, we have found our teacher, And what we are seeking are ways to become better practitioners of what we think we already know. And my experience is that I am continually learning that what I thought I knew, I didn't know. That make sense? You'll see in a minute an example of that. So we want to become wiser and find more useful ways of becoming answering people in this time and place. So I'm calling this talk today, Becoming Answering People. So one of the most important things we can do in becoming answering people is learning and creating the kind of lives we say we want is by learning how to control our states of mind. This is especially true if we're going to practice what I'm calling active hope. Active hope, by the way, is a hope that is not dependent on circumstances. It is not the same as optimism. Things don't have to turn out our way for us to be hopeful people. Unless we are in intense physical pain or we are stressed to the point of being unable to focus, we all have the capacity to control our state of mind. And if we don't do this, we can so easily be captured by the culture in which we live and by our own unconscious archetypes and shadows to the point of personal and other destruction. That's what you see going on in the news today. Captured by archetypes, violence, anger, patriarchy. You read almost all the time, or you hear in your own circle of friends about people who had apparently almost everything they needed to be happy. And they do something that derails their lives and the lives of their loved ones completely. So how do we learn to control our states of mind? There are two primary ways. First, by how we control the way we use and relate to our bodies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because all the information is out there that you need. But one of the most overlooked requirements to fulfill the moral obligation to be happy is to get enough sleep. People don't sleep enough. Get rest. Rest is not the same as napping, but you know what I mean. Take care of your body by what you put into it, and by working out, and by exercising your brain, and what you expose your mind to. It's really, really an important thing. The second way we can learn to control our state of mind is by what we pay attention to, what we think about, what we say to ourselves when we talk to ourselves. Some people have trained themselves, they have graduate degrees in paying attention to what they don't want and what they don't like. Guess what shows up in their life? What they don't want and what they don't like. Critical to this capacity of state of mind control is learning to pay attention to the kind and quality of questions we ask ourselves. This is a huge influence on our lives. You know, we're asking questions all the time, from the moment we get up to the moment we go to bed. Like, is it time to get up? What am I going to wear today? And am I ready for that thing at work today? Have I got my class prepared? What's for breakfast? Are you really going to wear that to our first meeting with a marriage counselor? Or how can any person in their right mind vote for? So one of the reasons I suggest you keep a journal is that it helps you get a handle of what's going on in your noggin. If you have a place to write things down, keep an eye on that gratitude list. That's a very important thing. What am I grateful for? What am I looking forward to? What am I learning that's enriching my life? And your life will be enriched not only if you do this personally, but if you take these questions and you talk about them around your breakfast table or dinner table or with your circle of friends. What did you learn today that was important? What are you looking forward to today? What are you grateful for? Jim Finley says that a question he uses and encourages others to use is, given everything, what's the most loving thing I can do for this person or for myself? in this circumstance? Given everything, what is the most loving thing I could say right now? Connected to this is putting ourselves in a place where our teacher, in whatever form that teacher takes, can put life-enhancing questions to us, which is about what we're going to undertake in looking at the miracles of Jesus. So you with me so far? All right. Here's a quick summary. This will be in on the website and sent out with the summary that goes out too. So if you're not on that list, there's a form you can fill out and to get there. So here's the summary. We're in a cultural context of much fear, anger, and divisiveness. Further, we live in what is accurately called a post-truth world. Why is that? What is that? What does that mean? How did that come about? Who's been complicit in that, in creating where we have a world of alternate facts? Our identity is that of people who seek to grow in those qualities I keep harping on: peace, love, joy, patience, and humility. And not to be seekers of these things, but to be practitioners of these things. And we're choosing to seek better, wiser ways to be practitioners using Jesus as our guide. And we're going to use the questions connected with the miracle stories and other incidents spoken about him as a roadmap for becoming wiser and more useful practitioners. This make sense? Okay. All right. Makes sense to me. I want it to make sense to you. So let's just do one real quick. And then I'll go back to work over there. You know the first miracle that Jesus performs in the Gospel of John? You will know the answer to this next week because you're going to read the Gospel of John. Actually, you'll know the answer to it in a few minutes. It's not the healing of a leper. It is not giving sight to a blind person. It is not raising somebody from the dead. Again, all of these are metaphors. They're not literal events. The first miracle attributed to Jesus is turning water into wine. And he does that so that the party can go on and on and on and on. This acted parable tells us a great deal about the personality of Jesus. Now, we don't know a lot about this story. I'll probably say some more about it as we go further along in the weeks ahead. It's a great story, and it has a great setting, and it's just one of the best stories in the whole thing. It's the first of 7 stories that John tells. He calls them signs, and he says, if you're going to understand the man that I'm going to talk to you about, you need to see it through these lenses. And this is the first one. This mind-changing, mind-altering substance that Jesus creates. Now, no one ever taught me this in Sunday school. But what this means is that Jesus and his disciples made a spectacle of themselves. They're the ones who drank up all the wine. You know, one of the criticisms of Jesus was that he was a drunkard. Read it. One of the criteria that biblical scholars use for determining whether something is historically accurate in the Jesus story is the rule of embarrassment. If something is just too embarrassing to say about your Messiah and it's in the story, it must be true. Like when Jesus' mother and his brothers and sisters came to get him because they thought he was nuts. You don't put a story like that in there if there's not something to it. I grew up in a home where the single focused moral issue was about drinking alcohol. It was not racism. It was not poverty. It was not even sexual immorality. That was just sort of assumed. The big issue was alcohol. So when I was old enough, and I think this must have been around 8 or 9, I said to my parents, I've always had this kind of cantankerous streak. So I said to my parents, you know, Jesus made wine. They drank wine all through the Bible. Paul even advises people to drink wine for your stomach's sake. And the response I got was, that wasn't wine. It was grape juice. In one of the places in Croatia where we went, I saw this sign in the store. So Jesus' mother comes to him in this story and says, son, there's a problem here. You caused it. You fix it. And Jesus asked a question. He says, what business of mine or yours is that? That's a great question. But Jesus makes 180 gallons of the best wine possible. That's not a small amount of wine. And you know, I've been reading and studying the Jesus story for decades. I don't mean a few years. I mean decades. And I just saw something about this story for the first time while working on this class. The water jars that Jesus used in which to make the wine were water jars that were used for Jewish purification ritual. They were set aside just for that, nothing else. And Jesus wipes away all the Jewish legal requirements by taking those particular jars and using them for something else. Wow. Jesus wipes away all those ceremonial washings. You know, the most frequent metaphor that Jesus used for the kingdom or the realm of reality in which he invited people, his most frequent metaphor was that of a wedding feast, a wedding banquet. I'm inviting you to a party that never ends. There's enough wine for everybody. And later in John's narrative, John 10:10 is where this is, the most important verse in the narrative. Jesus says, this is my translation of John 10:10, I am determined that people have real and eternal life, more and better life than they ever dreamed of. Now, if we're going to get on with the party, we have to make sure that everybody else enjoys the party too. I think that's one of the things it means to be an entering person. Jesus teaches that life is a wedding banquet for everyone. So this reveals Jesus' disposition toward the human race. It's one of affirmation, joy, unconditional love, great expectation. And if we see ourselves as friends of the bridegroom, we'll be focused on making sure we do everything we can to include other people in the party, to assure their happiness, that this is the best wedding party in human history. When I first suggested about 20 years ago so now that we had this moral obligation to be happy, there was a lot of resistance to that. And I understand that. There is a lot of suffering in this world, and I don't dismiss a bit of it. I have, during my lifetime, been with a lot of people who've died. Loved ones of mine as well, people as I barely knew. And I noticed that in the beginning, when people in healthcare or ministry or social services or with the dying people, we have a tendency to keep something between us and the dying person, a clipboard, a prayer book, or something. And as we get less frightened ourselves of death, and we can take those barriers away and simply be with people. You know what it's like to mourn. There are people in this room who are mourning right this minute. And in one of what I call his transformative teachings, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted in their mourning." We grieve the loss of those we love. I am not in any way minimizing that. Part of what it means to be human is to die. Even the sun will die. We all die. If, however, our identity is lodged in the God of Jesus as his was, not even death can kill us. In the throes of grief, we can forget this. This is why we need each other. What Jesus taught and what his early disciples got, which is why the movement caught on, is that in God there is no death. In God we live and move and have our being. And if we live in that awareness, we are no longer fearful of death. And further, we don't inflict death on others. We no longer cause anyone anywhere to mourn by killing their loved ones. We do not cause people to grieve. That is another mark of being an answering person. Biblical scholar John Deere writes, "Instead, like Jesus, we console people, lead people to life, give people hope, help people to celebrate joyfully the gift of life itself. We want everyone to taste the fullness of life." So one of the things I have learned in my work as a pastor, counselor, spiritual teacher is that in hospice, no one survives. But some are healed. Healing is not about getting back to the way things were. What is, is. Everything arises and falls away. It's the way of the cosmos. And it's from this perspective that the Sufis can say everything is perfect. Everything is the will of God. There are no dead ends in the spiritual life. Nothing is above or beyond redemption. Everything can be used for transformation. That's what this miracle is about. Sooner or later, life is going to lead us, as it did Jesus, into the belly of the beast, into a place where we can't control, fix, explain, or understand. And that's where transformation most easily happens, because that's when we're in the hands of God. That's when we're not trying to manage things. Richard Rohr writes, "Suffering is the only thing strong enough to destabilize the imperial ego. The separate and sufficient self has to be led to the edge of its own resources so it learns to call on the deeper resource of who it truly is but does not recognize yet." And you can call this the God self, the true self, the Christ self, the Buddha self, Buddha mind. Doesn't matter what label you put on it. It is who we truly are. And that's what we're trying to learn how to show up as. Again, loss is a fact of life. Impermanence is everywhere we look. We're all going to suffer our losses. And it's how we deal with those that makes all the difference. For it's not what happens to us that determines our character, our experience, our karma, our destiny. It's how we relate to what happens to us. It's in our seeking to become answering people that we experience the healing we are looking for. It's in learning to see in wholeness without dividing into what we like and don't like that we experience the wholeness that we are. Now, there are some of you who even right now are saying back to me, "But it's a madhouse out there." It is. You think it wasn't a madhouse in the world where the Jesus story grew up? It was and is in that kind of world that Jesus kept saying to those who followed him, "Don't be afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of. Love God, love each other, feed the hungry." Wendell Berry, one of my favorite poets, puts it like this: When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I'm free. That's what answering people do. That's a beautiful poem. We rest in the grace that is not dependent on worldly circumstances. That world is called the kingdom of God. It's not off out there somewhere. You don't have to die to go to heaven. It's here. Answering people learn how to be there. Answering people learn how to be. How to be here. How to be here now. Now, you may not be aware of it, but there's a part of you that knows this so deep down and so true. It's how you came into the world. That's what Jesus is all about with his questions, and those who answered them became answering people. I have, ever since I first discovered him, loved the poetry of Hafiz. Hafiz was a Persian poet who lived in the 14th century. And there is a poem of his on the landing page of the Ordinary Life website. It's one that I love and used to know by memory. I might have to look at my notes. But the small man builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage who has to duck his head when the moon is low keeps dropping keys for beautiful rowdy prisoners. That poem contains so much. It's about growing. It's about becoming those kind of people. It's about being free and loving people and being free, making sure that other people are free and loving as well. But this is the poem that I had in mind when I said, you already know this. This is part of your true identity. We just forget it. We think this spacesuit that we use to get around on this planet is who we really are, and it's not. That's why some people can get caught up with something as superficial as the color of a person's skin to identify them. Here's another poem by Hafiz. Every child has known God, not the God of names, not the God of don'ts, not the God who ever does anything weird, but the God who knows only 4 words and keeps repeating them, saying, come dance with me, come dance with me, come dance with me. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargoes, so watch your step, and I will see you here next week. Thank you. Thank you.